I guess the last thing you want up as a son of a minister after somebody just preached like Roscoe did. I only hope at 85 years old I can get up. It's great to see his level of enthusiasm. Let me welcome all of you to Washington and thank you for caring enough to come here. I'm reminded that my dad believed that every one of his children should be exposed to every religious experience. And I remember that hot summer day that he told me we were going to a Baptist revival. Now, I'm not going to ask how many Baptists there are in the room. I imagine there are a few of you. And I don't know about you, but I think Baptist preachers missed their calling. They should have been meteorologists because a year in advance they could pick the hottest week of the summer to schedule the revival at. And I never will forget that night. We went in underneath that tent, and the preacher had hit his Saturday stride on a Wednesday. He looked down in the crowd and said, "Jim, do you want to go to heaven when you die?" And Jim said, "Yes, sir, preacher." He said, "Come up on stage." He said, "Mary, do you want to go to heaven when you die?" And Mary said, "Yes, sir, preacher." He said, "Come up on stage." Looked down at Bruce and said, "Bruce, do you want to go to heaven?" And Bruce said, "No, sir, preacher." The preacher looked at him and said, "You don't want to go to heaven when you die?" He said, "When I die, sure. I thought you were getting a group up to go today." That's sort of how America responds to change. You know, we're all for it until the realization that they're talking about now, today. And all of a sudden we come up with every excuse in the world as to why we can't be part of it. And I don't want to try to recover everything that you've heard from a great list of speakers. I just want to say this. We can't get there doing things the way we've always done them. We can only get there by checking the box D, all the above. Now, if all of us had spoken to you last Wednesday, you might have gotten a slightly different speech. But we've been impacted by what's happened over the weekend, the tragedies in Japan. It will take some time to figure out what took place in some nuclear generation facilities. But I've got to share with you that it was Thomas Jefferson that said, "I'm not an advocate of frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must advance to keep pace with the progress of the human mind." That means that we have an obligation as policymakers to always incorporate that increase in knowledge to try to put that in place in policy to allow our country to expand, to take advantage of human intelligence. And we stand a better chance than the Chinese or the Middle East or the Russians to actually have exponential change because we have things like the rule of law and protection of intellectual property and things that reward society here for their breakthroughs. Where are we hampered? We're hampered by the federal government, by our policies, by our insatiable urge to overregulate and undervalue the types of changes that we need. So what happens when I say D, all the above? Yeah, it does mean we need some domestic exploration. Doesn't mean that we tap 100% and use it all right now. Roscoe's exactly right. The first thing you start with is telling the American people, hey, we've got to conserve. And it's amazing how fast a teenager will conserve if their choice is, well, you're not going to get a gas card, therefore you can't get gas, so your car won't have fuel in it. They all of a sudden get it. But look at how quickly, after we went through $4 a gallon gas just over 2 years ago, we've reverted to where the largest group of trucks and cars sold are trucks and SUVs. It's no longer are we thinking about the gas mileage that we get. Conservation is something that just sort of flew out after the 70s, and we all saw it as a ridiculous thing that Jimmy Carter went out and talked about. It is the biggest impact that we can have on our energy future and our energy cost, is what we can all do at home. Look at what the Japanese did over the weekend. Prime Minister walked out and said, "I need you to conserve. And we're going to have rolling blackouts." They haven't had a rolling blackout yet because Japanese actually went out and did it. They went out and started cutting off lights. They found ways to conserve. And I might remind you, they're doing it at a much more difficult time because it's cold over there now. It's not air conditioning that they're doing without. In a lot of cases, they're doing without heat. So it's a fascinating lesson for us all to watch, and our hearts and prayers go out to the Japanese people that they will recover from this. But it also tells us just how big a task we've got in front of us. Saxby Chambliss and I will reintroduce an energy bill that we introduced a little over a year ago. It will focus on a path forward for the United States, one that's responsible, one that's rooted in conservation, one that provides a path for new exploration, one that increases our footprint in nuclear generation, one that uses natural gas as the only flexible fuel we have in the United States and can bridge that gap between petroleum needs or lack of petroleum and our needs, and a transition to more natural gas as a mobile energy, both helping with emissions but also reducing our footprint need from the Middle East. At the end of the day, this is both an economic security and a national security issue, that we are less reliant and a pathway to no reliance on the Middle East for the future energy costs of the United States. If you can't make the case just from a standpoint of the difficulties that it puts the United States in from a policy standpoint, then let me suggest this, that as Roscoe talked about our children's future, without the ability to compete, what future do our kids have? Our ability to competitively compete in a global marketplace requires, number one, predictable, stable energy cost. And if you chart the United States over the last decade, we've had anything other than stable, predictable energy cost. If you look at the reason that companies continue to flee the United States, it's on three fronts: taxes, regulation, and the need for predictable energy cost. So I'm convinced that we do our children the best benefit by providing them a framework that makes energy costs sustainable and predictable in the future, because that assures them of a global competitiveness in business that is absolutely essential to their level of success, but also to the level of success of the United States. Now, having said all that, it's certainly lacked any degree of specificity. I will assure you, when Saxby and I introduce our bill, it will sufficiently cover that box D. Yeah, we're prescriptive on where we'd like to go on nuclear. We are specific on how we would like to use natural gas as transitional fuel, but we want to tap every alternative that America can come up with and the world can come up with. It's just we don't want to pick winners and losers. That's not the role of the federal government. The role of the federal government is to set a framework up where we assure everybody can play and can play equally and competitively. It's the marketplace that has to determine whether a technology survives or it doesn't. I don't believe that the artificial tools that we have within government, which are usually subsidies, are necessarily a sustainable long-term solution to a short-term problem. What we've got to be focused on, and I think Roscoe alluded to this very well, we've got to quit looking for short-term fixes. We've got to have a long-term strategy. You know, it's really been since the 1980s since we had an energy policy in this country. How in the world can we expect the American people to buy in to a direction on energy if we haven't painted them a picture of where we were going to go? If we haven't given them some clear understanding of where it is we're going, so that we've challenged their buy-in to that. If you can't paint the picture, we'll never get conservation. If you can't paint the picture, you'll never do responsible exploration at home. If you can't paint the picture now, we won't build any more nuclear generation. If you can't do all the above, let me assure you, you will not have predictable energy prices in the future, but you will also find that at certain times, the environment will be the biggest loser in a patchwork policy of energy decisions that are made, because we will move to something because of the cost versus because of the consequences. So I'm excited about the opportunity that we've got a new Congress. We're early in it. The opportunity to launch legislation. But make no mistakes about it. This is not business as usual. And I want to end on this, and I'll be happy to take questions if that's appropriate. We're going to spend $3.7 trillion this year. We're going to collect $2.2 trillion. We have a delta of $1.5 trillion. America's consumed through the national media of whether the cut's going to be $10 billion or $61 billion. Let's for a second just go through a little exercise. Eliminate all discretionary spending, all of it, every partnership we have with the American people. Eliminate all defense spending. We know we're not going to do it, but let's do it for a second. You still have a budget gap of $200 billion. What's the takeaway for you? Takeaway is you can't get to fiscal sanity in the United States without reforming Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. What Roscoe said was those of us that are up here have to be not consumed by the next election, but consumed with instituting the right policy for our future to be sustainable and predictable. That's what I hope is going to overtake this process, because anything short of that, no matter how smart we are in energy policy or how creative we are as it relates to addressing a turnaround in the economy and job creation, if you've got a country that is insolvent, then you've handed the next generation with a debt that they will never be able to shake or to eliminate. If you don't believe me, look around the world. There are people in that shape right now. Their options are few, and their problems are many. We still have an opportunity to turn from that and to make sure that our children options are plentiful and their future's bright. Be happy to take some questions. Yes, sir.